Hello, and welcome to Paul's Thorn, a podcast about disability in the Bible. Inspired by Paul's mysterious thorn in the flesh in 2 Corinthians 12:7, in this podcast we'll be exploring disability in the Bible, examining its stories, meanings, and impact on faith, examining how Scripture portrays disability. We'll look at challenging some common interpretations that I think maybe at times have not been as fair as they could be, and also seek to offer some fresh theological insights. My name is Angelie Vincent, and I'll be your host for this conversation. Thank you for joining me today. So as a little bit of background for this podcast, the reason why this particular topic is of such importance to me is that I am a person with disabilities who is also a Christian. And so at times those two identities and how they interface have been interesting and kind of challenging sometimes to coincide. And so I've often turned to Scripture in order to understand better or to find a context for my disabilities and for essentially the life that and mission that I was given. So I thought I would actually start by reading 2 Corinthians 12:7 to provide some context and background as to the name of this podcast. And this is a story that when I first read it in the Bible, I felt very inspired by, or I guess it resonated with me. And so to me, it became something that I came back to often. So this is from the New International Version. Paul's vision and his thorn. I must go on boasting. Although there is nothing to be gained, I will go on to visions and revelations from the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up in the third heaven. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, but God knows, was caught up to paradise. He heard inexpressible things that man is not permitted to tell. I will boast about a man like that, but I will not boast about myself, except about my weaknesses. Even if I should choose to boast, I would not be a fool, because I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain, so no one will think more of me than is warranted by what I do and say. To keep me from becoming conceited because of these surpassingly great revelations, there was given me a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan, to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Again, as a person with disabilities, that particular verse, especially the end, I found very impactful and something that really has resonated with me as I've been on my journey. So I'll give some background, both who I am as a disabled person and then also sharing, who I am as a Christian or my faith journey, in order to provide some more context about why I started this podcast, and also why that chapter resonates so much with me. So to start with, I have 3 disabilities. I'm diabetic. That's something that I first developed as gestational diabetes years ago. It went away, but then it came back it's been about 14 or 15 years ago, at a time when work was very stressful. And so I apparently was really internalizing the stress. And so I noticed I started to lose weight very rapidly. I thought it was a good thing at first. It turned out not to be. It turned out that I actually needed to be very careful about things. But as far as a context of my Christianity or my faith journey and being diabetic, I don't know that I feel quite so much it has been impactful, other than I'm always aware, because of the health complications associated with being diabetic, that, I need to be mindful of things, and also be aware that, it could eventually be what causes me to die. So I from that standpoint, I guess it keeps me grounded to some degree. My second disability is I have celiac disease. That was something that I developed maybe not far after the diabetes. And from a faith standpoint, that also probably doesn't quite have as much of a direct impact, because like the diabetes, I see those as conditions that I have to manage. But it's interesting with the celiac disease. One of the ways it does manifest, I guess, as far as an intersection with faith, is that the question of taking communion, especially if gluten-free host is not an option, can be interesting. And so that always comes up as a point of contention in some churches. And even recently, I think it was 2 or 3 months ago, I'd heard that there was a church that had made the decision they would not offer gluten-free communion anymore. So that's always kind of interesting, because it feels like you either have the option of taking communion that has wheat in it and then hurting yourself, because that's with celiac, if you eat wheat, it actually causes internal damage to your intestine. Or you could basically not participate and then feel like you are not necessarily participating fully in the experience of communion, and not being as closely connected to the religious community as you would like to be. I think it's always good as a Christian to feel like you're connected to other Christians. And then my third disability is one that I've had my entire life, though I didn't realize it until, I guess it was in 2019 I was diagnosed. So I was diagnosed at that point, which is a little bit of a late diagnosis, at 48 with autism. So that was something that when I was diagnosed suddenly provided a lot of context to my life, and answered a lot of questions, I suppose. So I had been autistic my entire life, but until about 2018, I didn't know much about autism, other than some of the false things or false ideas that people have about there being a connection with vaccinations. At least I think it's a false connection. But I did know that I had been very different my entire life from other people. And so the diagnosis for me suddenly provided a name to that difference and explained to me why, again, that I had been unlike other people my whole life. So 48's a little bit late to discover, why you are so different from folks. I often joke to people in context of religion that I do understand what it was like to wander in the desert for 40 years, because that's what it feels like to not have a diagnosis or to not know who you are in the context of something that's so definitive or so defining in you as a person. So again, my whole life I had always felt different from people. I'd always had communication and social challenges. I'd been in speech class as a child, even though I did actually walk and talk from an early age. I have always struggled with communication as far as speaking to a degree. Occasionally, if I get too excited, to stutter a little bit. I have trouble pronouncing certain words, certain letters. R was always a challenge when I was a child, and so I did take speech class in order to work on pronunciation. And at times, things like reversing words or putting different letters, like I'll flip letters in a sentence, that kind of thing, as far as the communication struggles go. But I also always had social challenges. I didn't notice quite so much when I was, say, in elementary school, from the time I was maybe 3 or 4 until about 8 or 9. I didn't see myself as being any different really than the other children. I probably didn't have a lot of context, obviously, at that age for kind of how other people were, but I didn't feel othered or different from them. But when I first went through puberty, that's when I started to really understand that there was something unusual about me, or some difference. And so there were, I guess a lot of it came down to social challenges. So struggling to fit in with other people, struggling to say the right thing, I've angered people over the years and didn't understand exactly why I had angered them, or frustrated them for that matter, and didn't understand why. I knew that it was at times, it was harder for me to connect with people and to feel like they connected with me. Sometimes they would misinterpret what my intentions were. So all those things were challenges for me. And I also struggled quite a bit with any life transition. So like the transition from elementary school to junior high school to high school, and then after high school. Every time I came to any kind of change like that, I knew I stumbled when other people didn't stumble. And so I knew that there had to be a reason for that, but I didn't have any context for that. For most of my 20s and 30s, I guess, again, I didn't know anything about autism, so I didn't think about myself as being autistic in any way. Again, everything I knew about autism was more a portrayal of somebody like Rain Man than, thinking of that person or seeing myself in that person. But I did have struggles, and so some of those struggles did seem like, as I started to get older, were getting more and more difficult. Life in general just seemed to be getting more difficult for me. Part of that was at work. I have worked for a bit, but I noticed that it was harder for me to get ahead because it was harder for me to kind of network. It was more of a challenge for me to connect with my coworkers. It was very exhausting sometimes to be at work all the time, to understand the context of things. And it just felt like, again, that was the gap between me and other people was growing as I got older. And so I would also find myself, as things went along, kind of pulling more and more into myself because I was noticing those differences and noticing how it felt like I was deficient or not like other people. Or, just sometimes you anger people or you frustrate them and you don't know why. And so it makes you kind of pull into yourself. You start to internalize a lot of that challenge because you don't understand that it's related to the disability. You just know somehow that you're somehow different, or you think you're wrong, or, I guess just not fitting in. A square peg in a round hole, I suppose. So about 2018 then, I had started to understand more about autism, and maybe it was at that period it became a little more well known. But in reading about it, really understood for the first time that I probably was autistic. And so I did seek out an evaluation so that I would have the answers for sure, and was diagnosed again at 48. So that diagnosis to me was very life-changing. I know a lot of people probably would not be happy to be diagnosed with autism, but for me, I was very excited to have an answer and to have a context. And so at the beginning there was a lot of excitement, but then that kind of quickly followed with really trying to relive or go through all these experiences in my life that I had been through and hadn't understood the context of, and try to find some answers to understand that better. And to also kind of think about my autism from the standpoint of religion and from my faith. And so I kept kind of coming back to one point over and over again. And I know, again, a lot of people wouldn't see being diagnosed as something great and amazing, But for me, it really was. And something that I kept coming back to was this. It's from Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. And so for me, that felt like the diagnosis finally answered a big question as to what my journey was, what my mission was. I also, again, knew that after years of feeling like I was a very different person or didn't fit in, that I was specifically created by God as an autistic person to fulfill the mission that He had for my life. So with that new context, for me, it changed a lot of things, like how I understood my disability and how I related that disability to my faith. And that, again, kind of bringing that back, that was again why the Paul's Thorn question or the verse resonated so much with me, kind of thinking of that verse in the context of what it meant to be disabled. Was it that this was something that was kind of given to me like a thorn, like a tool of Satan, or was this something that I was given by God in order to fulfill a mission other people couldn't fill, and to kind of go places other people couldn't go? And so that led me to really explore the Bible in a new context. Now, to understand a little bit more about why the Bible was so important to me, I'll share with you my faith story. So I was raised in a family that was a bit unusual in that while my mother was a very devout Christian from an apostolic, basically Pentecostal background, my father is an atheist. I don't know very many people who have that particular background, but it's always spoken to me because it meant that in our family people could be respectful despite differences and also learn to be open-minded, despite having very different opinions about things. So we were basically, both my parents decided to share their personal views with us and to kind of provide us the opportunity to explore both of those paths. But it was also understood from a very early age that we would go with my mother to church. And so every Sunday we went to church at a Spanish-speaking church. And so that was interesting. One of the things I've always struggled with as my communication is that despite the fact that I was heavily exposed to Spanish my entire life, I've never quite been able to pick it up very well. And so we went to the Spanish church, and I would not understand, I would say probably 75% of the things that were spoken or said in that church. But I guess I got enough that I felt, very much like I didn't feel like I was an outsider to that church. And I understood the message and was also excited to go every Sunday, though sometimes I lacked the discipline that we were supposed to have. I'll give an example. We were supposed to read one chapter a day in the Bible so that when we came into church on Sunday, we would be prepared to discuss what we'd read. So I would go all week without having read any of the Bible, and then Sunday morning get up very early and read my 7 in a row very fast so that I could make sure that I had my homework done essentially in time to go to church. But the church was very interesting. And again, I felt very connected. I enjoyed a lot of the church as far as the singing and the discussing God and feeling like I was very loved and cherished by God as part of that church. But also, again, very different. And not knowing it was the autism, I just knew that I felt very different from everybody else. And the things that I wanted in my life were not what the church was teaching me that I needed to want or that I should want. In little ways, sometimes the church I went to is an apostolic church, and so they were very strict about things like we had to have our head covered when we went into a church with a veil. We had to wear, if you're a girl, you had to wear women's or female clothing. So you had to wear skirts and kind of nice shoes and little frilly socks, that kind of thing. I've always been a bit of a tomboy. Always just liked to run around and explore, and so I always felt like I felt a little, I guess, restricted in having to wear some of those clothing. Also, I guess that somehow ties to the autism too, because clothing restriction or feeling comfortable in clothing is a big deal as far as texture goes. And so I think a lot of those dress clothes sometimes feel very itchy and you just don't feel very comfortable. I also knew little things that were different about me was that everyone wanted to grow up and get married and be a mother. And I knew that I wanted to grow up and be married someday and be a mother, but that wasn't all I wanted to do. I knew that I used to think I wanted to be a veterinarian. I ended up being an engineer, but I thought I wanted to be a veterinarian. And I wanted to help animals, and I had, these ambitious plans for myself, probably informed by the 70s and watching a lot of TV and seeing, what the world had beyond Texas, I guess, or beyond El Paso, and growing up. And the world seemed like an exciting place, and it just wasn't always as exciting, it seemed like, inside the church. And so as I got older, entering into the teenage years, I just felt more and more disconnected. And so, again, I always knew that always had atheism as a possibility, or I had started questioning whether I believed in God or not. I look back, though, and to be honest, I think that all the social challenges I had over the years, I probably felt more like I was abandoned by God, more so than maybe not believing in God. Also probably being very angry with God over the years, feeling like I was so different and not having a real context to understand, why that was the case. And so over the years, probably from my teenage years till about the early 30s, I quit being as engaged with God. I didn't give much thought to God. I didn't read the Bible. I wasn't as engaged in church. We would go to church if my mother would ask us to, but generally it wasn't super involved. If she wanted to take my kids when they were younger to church, I didn't have an issue with that. I just myself was not so engaged in participating in that community. So about 2001, 2001, ended up moving to Kansas in order for me to take a new job. And so that experience, it was from a financial standpoint and a career standpoint, was life-changingly amazing. But from a family standpoint and a loneliness standpoint, it was not. I suddenly had uprooted my family and moved to a place that we didn't know anybody, a place that we didn't have any family or experience in. And so I felt very lonely and very unsure or uncertain about whether I had made the right decision. I knew, again, that it was the right decision from a career standpoint, but was it the right decision for my family? So one day, feeling very lonely and unsure about our future, I had been on the bed crying when I turned to God for the first time in a very long time. And when I did that, I felt something come into my body and almost lift me off the bed. And I didn't have the context at that point to understand. But I had been filled with the Spirit. That experience obviously was life-changing. Over the years, I had been to some revivals at church and seen people who seemed to be filled with the Spirit, but I never thought that I would be experiencing that. And so when it happened to me, it was very surprising. So who I was before that moment and who I was after were just never the same. It made me feel more compelled to return to church and to be a part of the faith community again. About the same time, too, my sons had started to talk to me about attending a church. Culturally, it was very important to attend church, and they felt like all their friends went to church. And so it was something they wanted to participate in, too. So I started to look into the local churches, trying to find one who I felt I could join. I could, that their mission, their goals, and kind of their doctrine resonated with me and my beliefs. I couldn't find one that was an apostolic church, though I'll be honest, again, I had felt like I never quite fit in with them to begin with. I also knew that unlike most of my growing up, I did want to go to an English-speaking church because I felt like maybe I would get more out of it if I could understand, all of what was being said in the church. And so I ended up buying this book that went through what all the different denominations were, and it talked about what their core beliefs were. And when all was said and done, I ended up picking the Disciples of Christ Church, which also just by coincidence happened to be down the street, because I had heard, or at least what I had read in the book, was that they followed basically Jesus's word. And so to me, that was the right path to go on and to definitely to make a life focus. We did go to the church. We did choose to be baptized. It's funny because I actually felt a touch let down by some of the baptism experience. I was expecting it to be like when I had been filled with the Spirit, but I guess I was already full of the Spirit, so it didn't feel quite so day and night as it had the first time. But it was nice to see my children be baptized, and it was nice to be baptized into a church family and to feel like I was part of the group officially. One of the interesting things, too, that we had done at the church a little bit after when I had gotten there, or we'd started attending, was they had a program at the church in order to do the reading the Bible in a year plan. And so I had, again, never read the Bible very much except for those 7 chapters every Sunday morning because I wouldn't get in trouble growing up. And so it was the first time as an adult I had sat down and read the entire Bible. So the name of that Bible or the reading program they had at the church was Not by Bread Alone. And so that's inspired by Matthew 4:4. Man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. So, reading the Bible was suddenly just very life-changing for me. I had not sat through and read everything. I had heard a lot of things, again, because of the Spanish. I hadn't always understood a lot of things. But to sit down and read it was life-changing. And every day I was like, I can't believe that's in the Bible. Or, I'd read something and I'm like, oh, I've heard this before. And okay, now I understand the context for it. And I could feel God working in my life more and more as I started to be fed by the Word of God. I ended up volunteering as a Sunday school teacher. There was an opportunity to help support other children. I had teenage sons, and so that was an opportunity to kind of support them, but also the other teenagers in the church. And I also started to volunteer with the outreach committee because I felt that was also an extension. I really felt changed by being filled with the Spirit and by reading the Word of God, and so I wanted to be involved. I wanted to help people. I wanted to kind of do good things and support other people and spread the Word of God, and so feeling very inspired to participate. So kind of, again, in the background of all of that, though, is me being at work, kind of having my disability start to develop, still struggling as far as the social challenges, the communication challenges, things feeling like they were harder and harder. So from a work standpoint and a social standpoint, things felt like they were getting harder and harder every day. But from a faith standpoint, they felt like I had an answer, and it was so much easier. Like I felt like I was in tune with God for the first time, and I wasn't angry with God. And so from that standpoint, I felt like I was being nourished. But again, things, especially with the autism, were getting harder and harder. And so I felt like I was struggling more and more, and probably struggling with depression, because I was also, despite my faith, feeling more out of touch and out of sync with people. About that time, too, we ended up moving to Washington State in order to get a better career opportunity. And so, as I said earlier about transitions, that transition was quite a struggle for me. To go from, being very close, or had friends that we had developed over the years, our faith family, kind of understanding our place, we had a home and all of those things, and then making that sudden transition to a new state, to a place that was very different in many ways to where we had come from, and from Texas originally also, trying to kind of reconcile all of that. I was struggling with a lot of anxiety and a lot of depression. And so again, that part of my life seemed to be getting harder and harder, while my faith was, doing pretty good, I guess. It was starting to overtake everything. It started to become where that was, all I could think about were my differences. And I knew that at work, one of the issues I started to have was the communication problems were becoming more prevalent. I had a manager who had told me that as far as the job went, I was a good engineer, but I really needed to work on my communication. So that kind of set me into a tailspin, because I already had felt that there was probably a problem that was, there. I didn't know what it was related to, but then to have it said out loud is a whole different thing. It's kind of ironic, kind of as a sidetrack. I found out later this particular manager, that was their go-to comment to everyone. So it wasn't just me. I guess it's everybody needed to work on their communication, in their opinion. Also, because I was so concerned about the communication and so fearful about, would this impact my job? Will I get in trouble for not having good communication? We've moved all the way to Washington State. Is this, going to be a problem? I kind of went into a free fall and started taking all these classes. That was the only thing I could think of to do to fix this problem. Was they had classes like social or professional development classes that were offered through work. And I started taking every single one of them, thinking that if I could fix this communication problem once and for all, that that's a way that I could fix my life. And so, there was a lot of other things going on. It wasn't just the communication, but it definitely felt like more and more energy was devoted to trying to fit in, trying to keep my head above water than I'd had to do before. And so I found myself, I think, not turning away from God, but spending all of my free energy on trying to understand what was wrong with me instead of living a God-centered life. After my diagnosis, I realized that I'd been created this way. I didn't have to keep searching for an answer of what was wrong with me. I understood that this was how I was made. And so that suddenly, I could focus on God again, or I could focus on living a life that I thought was more productive than the one that I had been living, kind of going down a free fall of anxiety and depression. I'd started to turn back towards God again and started to really try to understand kind of context and understand my experiences. And so I decided, because I remember so well how that the Not by Bread Alone program had helped me to really focus on reading the Bible and understanding the life of Christ. And so one of the things I started actually listening to a lot of audiobooks too about the Bible and the apostles and history around the Bible. all just to get closer to God, I think, and also maybe as a way to worship, being thankful now that I understood my mission, or I understood my mission, or at least had the context for my mission and didn't have to wander anymore. So the year after, or I guess the Thanksgiving after I'd gotten my diagnosis, I was kind of getting the house ready. One of the things I always have liked to do is before a holiday do a major house cleaning, because it feels nicer if the whole house looks beautiful, kind of going into a holiday. But I had been spending quite a bit of time going into going into Thanksgiving by listening to audiobooks on the apostles' lives, and cleaning and just kind of meditating and reflecting on their histories and their stories. And I was filled with the Spirit for the second time. I don't know if the Spirit was gone the first time, or if I had spent so much energy and emotion that it had been kind of not smothered, but definitely not fed as I was on the journey to understand better. But it came back. And after that, I found that the first time was life-changing. The second time, I realized that I needed to focus more on kind of fulfilling my mission. And so I found myself maybe turning more and more away from the world from the standpoint of acquisition, or the standpoint of thinking about what I want out of my career, and started thinking about what my mission was and how do I fulfill that mission. And so I became very much convinced that my mission was to help other people with disabilities. And so, how to go about that, or, the next steps was then what I started to focus on. Focusing on how to help other people with disabilities, first manifested in getting involved with some resource groups around disability, but then also getting involved with a nonprofit around disability, so that I could, again, trying to go out there and help people who were like me. So it's been an interesting few years. I feel like the further I go, the better I'm getting at helping other people on their disability journey, the more I'm able to kind of move away from the old things like, being too emotional or being very frustrated and angry with people, and being to focus instead on what it means to be a Christian and to fulfill the mission that I was given. And so that's become, I would almost say, a special interest would be both disability, but also then the Bible, and how to kind of use my disability to fulfill that mission. So that was a lot of information dump, I guess, to get to the point of what this podcast was, which was, as I started to read more and more in the Bible, there are times when there were things that said about disability that were a little bit hard to reconcile with, or to understand, why that was there. And so that has led me to spend a lot of time thinking about disability in that context, and think about the different themes in the Bible around disability. And so that's the intention of this podcast, is to kind of explore those different themes, to talk about them and kind of work through them to understand them better, and understand, in that context, what it means to be Christian and to have a disability, and what does it mean about God's intention for your life and for what your job, or your impact that you are to have on other people. So as we move forward with the podcast, we'll be tackling or looking at those different major themes and what God intends for our life, and also to find acceptance and healing in our faith. So I want to thank you for joining me today. I appreciate the listening to kind of my life's journey and my intention. In 2 weeks, we'll be discussing our very first theme, which was how disability was used in Jesus' ministry in order to bring people to God. Please join me then. And until then, thank you again for joining me today. Paul's Thorn Podcast, copyright 2025 by Angelie Vincent, all rights reserved.